We've just officially hit noon Eastern, and so I'm just going to spend a couple minutes kicking us off and then turning it over to our presenter. But welcome. Thanks for joining us for our Best of Showcase today. We are in week 2 of our Best of Showcase. So I see some familiar names and faces. I know lots of you joined us for programming last week. Thank you for that. And we have a couple more sessions coming up this week. And those recordings will be available on our YouTube channel as well. A couple from last week are already posted. The rest are in process. So if you haven't registered for those that are coming up and would like to, that's still an opportunity that is out there. And I just in the chat put the link there if you're interested in registering for those upcoming sessions. And then I just want to share a couple other things that we have coming up. So in October in Columbus, which is where I'm located, where our central office is, we will be hosting our content conferences, the academic initiatives, business operations, and housing facilities conferences will all be running at the same time. And so registration for that remains open. And then as we get later into the fall, we will have some other virtual opportunities. Stars College registration closes very soon. So if you have an undergrad that is interested in that, have them look at that very soon. And then in October and November, we host our Multicultural Institute and our Live-In Symposium, both of which offer team passes. So if you're looking for something for your entire staff to do, there's some good pricing options there for teams to attend those opportunities. And then we also have right now we are looking for leadership for 2024. Believe it or not, 2023 is wrapping up, as much as I hate to think about it. And so we are looking for folks to serve as committee chairs, some of our conference chairs, those will be open. And we are also looking for folks to serve as faculty for some of our upcoming institutes happening in 2024. And those applications, I will put the link in the chat right now. Those applications are open and remain open through October. So if you're interested in serving us, serving with the organization, those opportunities are there. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenter today. We are joined by Beekah, who is the Student Success Coordinator and Conduct Officer at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and the 2023 UMR-ACUHO Best of Program winner. So all for you, Beekah.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm super excited. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. A little disclaimer as I am pulling this up. You're going to see that this presentation is Halloween themed. I am a Halloween enthusiast. This is the same exact presentation. I purposely chose not to change too much from when presenting at UMR, just because there's been a lot of cool things that have happened since then. And so I kind of want to highlight some of those things, which is going to be really fun. So just before I start talking and, get ahead of myself, is everyone able to see the orange spooky title slide that I have up? Beautiful. Okay, cool. Thanks so much. So, so we're going to talk about neurodiversity in residential life, how we can enhance our spaces instead of build barriers. So we are going to start out by just, giving a little introduction of myself. Then I'm going to tell a little bit of context of kind of my journey of how this has become like a really big thing accidentally as part of my professional career. So thanks so much for coming to this session. So I'm multiply neurodivergent, and I'm passionate about working with students in this intersectional population. Something I like to name is that neurodiversity is by far one of the most intersectional identities out there. There's a lot of stereotypes that being neurodivergent or autistic, for example, is strictly cis white boys, and that's not the case. It's very intersectional. It impacts and is all populations all across the board, all ages and everything. And we're going to get a little bit into that. So I look forward to spending the next hour-ish or whatever amount of time with you all. So back when we were doing this in person, I had a bunch of stims or fidgets, if you will. I'm holding one right now. That's one that's actually designed to be a fidget. But in this presentation, something that we did was I brought a bunch of things that were inexpensive that you probably have around your office that you can use as stems. So an example, paper clips. You can't see, there we go. Paper clips is one that I like to encourage folks to use. Googly eyes are really popular. So like from craft stores, ones that you can just kind of push down on, those are really big. Pipe cleaners, that's another one that are really inexpensive for you to have around for yourself or for others. And rocks. Rocks are another big ones because of that smooth feeling on them. They can be really nice for some folks. So that's just something we had out there that I just named that we utilized as an example of things that you can use to fidget stim with that aren't fidgets you have to go and purchase, that if they do walk away with a student or with a peer or whoever's using them, you're not going to be too upset about them disappearing. So with that, so here's kind of the plan for our time. So some introductions and some guidelines for this session, so we're all on the same page. Some current terminology, a breakdown from actually neurodivergent people. That's going to be something you're going to hear from me quite a bit. There's a lot of the content and a lot of the information that we're talking about is coming from the activist side of things. So people who identify as neurodivergent themselves. We'll talk about the neurodiversity movement a little bit, what it is, when it started, and kind of where it's going, because I think that's helpful for those that aren't as familiar. And if you are familiar, I think it's kind of cool to kind of look at the timeline because, I don't know, I'm a nerd, so I think it's fun. Then we're going to talk about ways our departments can improve. So a tangible list of things that you can take, leave, or think about. One thing you'll notice when we get to this section is that a lot of them seem really simple. That's because a lot of them are, which is really great. And they benefit all students and not just neurodivergent students, which is also very cool. Closing and ways to connect, and we can wrap up and I'll have my contact info at the end. And then if we have time, we'll have some time for questions and things like that. So a little about me and some guidelines, like I said. So this is an image of myself and my partner. My partner and I are college sweethearts. So we got together back when we were students at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I know we have some folks here watching, so shout out to y'all. Appreciate y'all being here and taking the time. The reason I put this image here is because that is when myself and my partner were diagnosed with various diagnoses that fall under being neurodivergent. So myself, I have multiple, and my partner has multiple as well. And it kind of started this journey for the both of us to really figure out self-discovery and figure out what does it mean to be diagnosed with something that really just explains how you experience the world when you're in your early 20s. And so it's been really fascinating to see where we've come from then to now. I obviously work in higher education, student affairs, and my partner works in nonprofits. So it's really interesting to kind of see some of those things. He works with a lot of more of the stereotypical neurodivergent kids, which is really interesting for us to compare notes at home while we're, eating dinner and things like that. So that's to name that. I really started talking about this and really getting into this when I was in college myself. So I was a social work major. I was really into the activism components of a lot of different things and the educational pieces as well. And from there, I actually started doing, again, on accident, you're going to hear a lot of accidental stuff, just because I'm somebody who just likes to do things. And so sometimes I do things and then those turn into other things. And then I'm very busy, but that's something that I like to do. I started doing neurodiverse affirming coaching. So I started doing some coaching started about 5 to 10 folks, and then that number grew, and right now I'm at a caseload of about 30 humans that I interact with outside of my full-time job. So that's coaching that I do that is meant for, my primary audience is late high school, early college, going through a lot of the stuff that, we are working through with our students on a regular basis. And so that's really cool to see. In my current work, something I've been able to do since presenting this presentation is I actually had that coaching that I do outside of work written into my now job description, which is really cool. So I actually get to work with students one-on-one on my campus, and I have about 15 of those that I get to work with regularly, which is really, really cool to see. And I'll kind of break down what that looks like for a neurodiverse person to be giving that coaching, because coaching is not therapy. Coaching is really just supporting and affirming students, which is really cool to have somebody. I work for a department where I'm able to say, hey, I'm openly neurodivergent, and then people around me know what that means, and that's really cool. So I'll break down kind of how we got to that point as well. So some guidelines for this session. So self-disclosure. So I personally self-disclose when I speak about this topic. I talk to parents, I do groups, I do workshops, I do, like I said, the coaching one-on-one. So for me, the self-disclosure is just easier because it's a topic I talk about a lot. So as we're doing discussion stuff later on and talking through questions and things, if you're in this space and you also are neurodivergent, you are not expected to do the same with the self-disclosure, please. please only self-disclose what you're comfortable doing. So I just do it because it's easier. It's just become a congruent thing that I do when I'm talking about these things. Reactions is something I like to name as well. So depending on your identities, your educational work history, and your family background, you may have a set of experiences surrounding this topic already, and that's okay. Depending on where you're at and what you've kind of seen, heard, read about, that could be different things, and that's fine. If I say something you disagree with, please ask a question. Chat with me after the session. This says in person because I was in person when we talked about it, but feel free to reach out. There's going to be a little survey at the end where I'll be able to get in contact with you all if you want to be in contact with me. So if there's something that you want to hear more about or want to talk about more, please, please, please do. That's my favorite part about doing these presentations, is the conversations we have afterwards, which can be really cool and really fun. Next is questions. Have a question, please ask. I think for this time, if you have a question as I'm going through, if you could, I'm going to steal something from student leadership. I'm the Madia region, and this is what we did during the pandemic. If you could just put an X in the chat if you have a question, that would be super duper appreciated. We're going to talk about language during this session, and so when asking a question, don't stress about what the right language is to use, please. Just ask your question, and then you can also name, hey, I'm not sure how this is supposed to sound. This is a zone for us to kind of walk through things and kind of talk about why some people might want to use different language over another. So this is a space that I ask that not to stress as much as maybe you think you need to. So with that, we're going to transition to current technology or terminology. So a breakdown from actually neurodivergent people. These are all neurodivergent endorsed. Whenever I create presentations like this, I actually have it peer reviewed by other neurodivergent people. So this presentation was reviewed by about, I think by the end of it, about 30 other neurodivergent people from a couple different walks of life, a couple other different identities. So just know that this is a sample of that many humans. It's not just my brain, because I think while my brain is pretty cool, my brain is the only, not the only brain that I like to be talking about whenever we're talking about this topic. So how to refer. So person first language versus identity first language. So a person with autism versus an autistic person. So the person first language puts the person first and the disability second, separates the person from the disability. And then the autistic or identity first language puts the disability first, emphasizes the disability as being a part of the person. So disabled people have the right to use the language that they prefer. At the end of the day, it's how they're going to be describing themselves and their own experience. When in doubt, ask the person which they prefer and reflect that language. I think that's super duper important, especially when we're in conduct meetings. We have something here at Mankato called critical issue chat. So a time when students are having conversations with us because they just need a little bit extra support. Like that's just a space where we're able to mirror that language, because at the end of the day, that's how they want to refer to themselves, and that's what matters. So why the conflict? So I'm going to break kind of down why there is a little bit of tension depending on who you're talking to. So in 1962, the American Psychological Association began using the term with the intention of separating the person from the disability and preventing labeling. That was the reason why they really wanted to do that at the time. Where identity first language comes in is after 1962, the following activist groups argued that identity first was more appropriate as the groups were simultaneously fighting for equal rights. So blind, the deaf and hard of hearing community, and then later the autistic community. Once the internet really became a thing, the neurodiversity movement really got its footing and really started moving really quickly once the internet and like chat rooms were a thing and other neurodivergent people were able to connect with each other, which is why they were a bit later. Then where we are today, so support professionals, so psychologists, doctors, legal documents, the ADA, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act use person first. Most, with the asterisks there, because it's not everybody, but most disabled people in the groups listed use identity first. All others usually typically use a mix of both. You're going to hear me use them interchangeably throughout this conversation and whenever you're chatting with me about the topic. I'm somebody who, back when I first learned about this topic in general, before my diagnosis, I was told person first is the only way. Then as I got into more activist spaces, it was identity first is the only way. And really what I've fallen into in my journey is just whatever grammatically makes sense is easier for the people that I'm trying to talk to understand. Because at the end of the day, that's what I care more about is whatever it is the topic is that we're trying to figure out together. So that's where I land on there. So the moral of the story, if you're not sure, ask. This is really important, and it's a way to affirm students, to make them kind of see that you've done a little bit of your own research so that you know that there is a little bit of a conflict. You don't have to say you're on either side. You don't have to name your opinion on it, but it is showing that you're aware of the conversation and validate the fact that they're able to do whichever one they want, and they have that autonomy to do so. So next, breaking down neurodivergent versus neurotypical. So a neurodivergent, emphasis on that second part, someone who has or is one or more of the following divergent neurocognitive functions. So autistic, ADHD, or kinetic. A lot of ADHD folks are shifting to using the term kinetic to define themselves. Not everybody, but a fair amount are. So I named that there. So I'll use those two interchangeably as well. Dyslexic, dyspraxic, etc. There's a lot of those. Bipolar and many more. Neurotypical, emphasis on the typical part, someone who is or does not have anything listed to the left. So they are considered typical because their neurocognitive function is in the societal norm. So for them, it's typical because that's the norm within our society. So some other common language things, I'm going to add a little bit on here because I've had a couple conversations recently, and I have a couple. I did a session, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where we got a little bit more in depth, but I have something that I can give to y'all if you're interested. Functioning labels are dated. So instead of saying high functioning and low functioning, we're pivoting to saying high support needs and low support needs. Reason for this is because right off the bat, functioning looks really different for everybody. So for me, for example, sometimes I just need a little bit more help, and other times I don't need any help at all, right? I'm functioning the entire time, and it's a little bit less label-y, I guess, if that makes sense, versus just, what somebody needs in a moment. Time blindness is another one. So time blindness is the experience of measuring time differently. So 1 hour can feel like 1 minute. I don't know if that says house. I apologize for that. So 1 hour can feel like 1 minute, for example, for folks. This is really common when we are talking about ADHD or being kinetic. There's a couple doctors out there that are actually doing some really cool research about how ADHD isn't a deficit, but more is seen with what the research they're doing right now is seen as just a perception of time being a bigger issue. And so I'm excited to see what that kind of turns into. But if you research it, there's a couple of things that have gone viral recently of some people saying that this isn't real, which is unfortunate. So that's my little warning to you. If you do Google that there are some not so great and some little ableist articles out in the wild about that. But just know that there's some good stuff out there right now of really looking at ADHD and being kinetic from that time perspective, and really strengths focused instead of trying to change humans, which is kind of why I do what I do. Next, Asperger's no longer exists. So in 1994, the DSM-4, Asperger's, autism, and sensory processing disorder were all individually listed. And then when the DSM-5 came out in 2013, autism spectrum disorder was created and encompassed all of those that were listed there. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that on the next slide, and kind of explain why the stars are there and everything. Last is self-diagnosis. So for autism specifically, a diagnosis is a long and expensive process. I usually share with students and other folks. Mine, for example, was $3,000 after insurance that I had to pay out of pocket. Thankfully, I was very privileged and had the ability to do that at the time, but that is not feasible for many, many students, which is really unfortunate. But many individuals self-diagnose with a licensed professional. So say, for example, they're going to counseling, a therapist, and they'll both agree, yeah, that's probably something you should get assessed for. I'm seeing, signs of this and those types of things, but they do not complete a full assessment because it is very, very expensive to do. So you'll hear a lot in the activism communities, or if you're working with a student who maybe says, yeah, I'm self-diagnosed, that's usually where it's coming from, is somebody in a medical field has said, yeah, this is something that I think you should pursue, but the cost component just makes it unrealistic for a lot of folks, which, like I said, is very, very unfortunate. So quick disclaimer about the language and Asperger's. So since the DSM-5 came out in 2013, the majority of our students, at least for the next couple of years, and staff who are diagnosed in adulthood likely have an Asperger's diagnosis on their records and things. And so the way our medical system works, it's not like all of our stuff just gets updated to the current terminology, that we just have whatever it was we were assigned back when we had our initial things diagnosed. So there might be folks that feel a sense of identity with the diagnosis and choose to still use it, and that's up to them. Back when this presentation was given, I believe this was the time that J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, was going viral for some anti-Semitism topics. So in here, and naming the rise of anti-Semitism, this topic is just being discussed more. There's some evidence that the person that Asperger's is named after was part of the Nazi Party, and there was a lot of history there, and is part of the reason why that term was taken out and autism spectrum disorder was used instead. So if you're working with a student who identifies with this language and label, the right thing to do is use whatever language they prefer. I was diagnosed post 2013, but with the students that I work pretty regularly who were diagnosed, say, in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, for example. It's really weird as an adult to be like, okay, now I'm going to change this now that I have this whole identity around it. So just know that that's something that is a conversation, that is a thing that is out there. Usually in activist spaces, we use those stars there just because we want to be respectful for those that are not a fan of the word and the term for very, very valid reasons. So next, the neurodiversity movement. So what it is, when did it start, and where are we now? So it's a branch of the disability movement. It started, so that was late 1800s to now. It's still going. We're not done. It's a social justice movement that seeks civil rights, equity, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent folks. So it started technically even before this, but it was first used in the academic sense in the late 90s. Like I said earlier, with the increase of use of the internet, many neurodivergent people were connecting for the first time when they previously had been isolated. And this increased communication that led to advocacy groups, which is really cool. So before that, it was actually used more commonly in chat rooms. That was something that really was created online by neurodivergent people. Judy Singer's work did end up coming up, and then that kind of allowed for folks to use it in other spaces. But I'd say the first time I think we have record of it that it was used online was around a little bit earlier than that. So where are we now? So the ADA has allowed for many more neurodivergent people to have access to higher education, which is great, but increased representation in all areas. Hashtag Makeshift Happen is something that has been going around and needing a need for more neurodivergent affirming practitioners. And so something I like to always name is that as we're having more neurodivergent people in a higher ed space, and the more times that we're having people be more knowledgeable, it's more important than ever for us to be more knowledgeable about what that is, what that means, how that impacts our work. I think when I see it the most, it has to do with roommate stuff and different impacts there. So ways our departments can improve. So the reason you're here. So the current reality is neurodivergent students tend to need more one-on-one support and attention. So going back to that support language versus that functioning language, that's really where we come in. So a set list of things to change to make things perfect doesn't really exist. I'm not going to give you a whole thing of do these things and you're going to be the best neurodivergent affirming department ever. I wish that would make my job very easy, but alas, that's not the case. The things that we're breaking down here is an ever-growing list that will be built upon for years to come. So I say that to keep in mind as we're moving forward. So here at Mankato, I do a couple cool things before I get into some of those things that you all could do on your campuses, but more some context to kind of show what we we've been doing. So I, an undergrad, grad school, and then now have started a couple neurodivergent multicultural groups, which has been really cool. With my undergrad and grad, I started them as a student, and now I'm the advisor to the group here on campus. But having a community is one of the most essential parts for our neurodivergent folks to have a sense of belonging on our campuses and feel connected. Neurodiverse students tend to kind of attract to each other anyway, which is really great. But an organized student group is really cool when you're able to make that happen. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to create those as I've gone throughout my journey. Something I started that I talked about a little earlier was the Neurodiversity project. So we have a little handout that our hall directors use. It has all my information that they're able to utilize when they're working with students, that they can come meet with me and talk about stuff from a neurodivergent perspective, talk about their experience and things that they can access with someone who gets it, is kind of the way that we, not how we described it, but how students talk to each other about it, which is really interesting. And we talk about things that we would talk to neurotypical students about all the time, but through that neurodivergent lens, which is really affirming and allows for that connection to happen, which is really, really cool. And then lastly, training. So I do student staff trainings, professional trainings, campus partners who interact in our spaces trainings, and things like that. I'll show this on the screen later if we have the time or if you all are interested, but we also have a referral form, so people are able to refer folks to me to interact with and meet with them, which is really cool. And it's specifically in our residential life department, but it's kind of unintentionally expanded to across campus because our accessibility resources or disability resources office is very, very busy and has a different set of priorities, which is really great. They do really good work. This is strictly for neurodivergent support, which has been really cool to do. So understand that neurodivergent people become neurodivergent college students and then neurodivergent professionals. We don't disappear. That's something as we get to Q&A time, something I like to name too, because like for myself, I'm sure there are other folks in the room who maybe were diagnosed earlier on in life, or that's part of their identity now. That's not something, the diagnosis doesn't just go away. So when we're talking about neurodivergent students, there are probably staff members in the room, so being cognizant of that. So when going into one-on-one conversations with students, so I'm specifically thinking of conduct, check-ins, one-on-ones, that type of thing, being aware of the following. So sensory experiences, instead of time management, shifting to energy management, that's a really big one. Brooks Hetley, who used to be at K-State and I think now is at NDSU, was the first person to really talk to me about energy management, and that literally changed my life as a neurodivergent person. As soon as I figured out how to manage my energy versus beating myself up every time I couldn't get something done in the allotted amount of time, was just so affirming. So that's something I encourage you to look through and look into, honestly, for all students, but that really, really benefits neurodivergent students. Again, stimming, I kind of talked about some of those pieces earlier on of things that you can do that aren't expensive. Like you don't have to order a whole bunch of stim toys off Amazon. You can technically get a whole bucket of them for like $20 on Amazon, which is nice. And then a lot of times, like this run, for example, was at our local festival. We had a Pride Festival a couple weeks ago that they just handed out as a freebie, but you can have those freer ones and just really normalizing what you're allowed in your spaces. So for example, our main staff meetings we have as a professional staff, and then also our meetings with our student staffs, we encourage standing up if you need to. We encourage moving around in the space during the meeting and not having to stay stationary. For the primary reason is we want people to be actively engaged and be able to talk about things in those spaces without, without having to be sacrificing pieces because they're not able to fully pay attention. So they're able to do what they need to do within reason to stay actively engaged in the conversations. And the last one, this one I say a lot, Midwest nice is dumb. I'm a Midwest person. I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm in Minnesota now, went to grad school in Kansas. Midwest nice is super cool. We have the best of intentions. But for people like me, it's really, really hard to figure out what exactly you're expecting of me, what a student's expecting of you. If you want a student to do or understand something, make sure that it's clear. A phrase that I use with our student staff during training about a month and a half ago. Yeah, that's how time works. A month and a half ago is a lot of phrases that we use that are that Midwest nice of kind of those filler pieces. Something I encourage students to think about is, unless there's an intention and you actually actively want to have them do something, like I hope you have a nice day, or I hope you do this, whatever. Unless you actually want that, it's not super useful to outline there. And I encourage them to think of that extra niceness as filler, because for a lot of them, that's how they were utilizing it. So if you're not from the Midwest, that might not be as a direct thing that you're able to connect to, but naming it here, because I think it's really big, especially in the region that I'm currently in. So next one, programming events. So when students show up by themselves and lurk, invite them in and give them something to do. They saw the poster / want to make connections. Something that's also really common that I see, that I work with students a lot. There's something called, has two different names. It's something called parallel play and then body doubling. What that basically means is, say for example, you have one student and another student who are friends, both neurodivergent or neurotypical, doesn't matter. They're in the same space, but doing completely different things, and they're still engaging with each other in that space. So say, for example, I'm reading a book, my friend's doing a puzzle, we're still in that space and getting that benefit of having someone around us, someone with us, which can be really beneficial. So a lot of our students will come to events, and that's what they need to do, and that's what they want to do to be engaged. And so that's something, one, I think it's really important to normalize, and two, having those conversations with other students when they do start using some of those concerning languages, like people lurking or being creepy, because that's typically not the case if the student is neurodivergent. But my favorite tactic is to just go up and talk to the person and then say, hey, do you want to be involved? Do you not want to be involved? And if they say no, I say, cool, let me know if that changes, and then move on. And that's pretty simple, but that's usually what I recommend, and then have actively had our staff do as well. And then next, it's okay to pull a student aside if they're doing something to make others feel uncomfortable. A lot of times we don't know, right? So for example, I'm gonna grab a pen real quick. If one day I wake up and I decide that clicking my pen like this is the best thing that's gonna keep me focused, I'm gonna try my best to think about what other people need. But unless someone else names, hey, that pen clicking is really distracting me, I'm not necessarily gonna think about it right away, because I'm just so excited that I have something to help me stay engaged. So neurodivergent person asking you all, if that's something that you see someone doing, please say something, because that can honestly be a form of care that you're showing to the student, to name that something is impacting others, because they might not notice right away. Next one, this one can be a little controversial, so I name that before I say it. Roommate conflict. So neurodivergent students tend to be vilified in roommate-related conversations, or feel vilified, unless they're direct. Students will struggle. So what I mean by this one is, a lot of times we'll have, say for example, we have community advisors, or some folks call them resident assistants here on our campus. We'll be talking to the neurotypical student, and they'll say, oh, my roommate does all of these things, they're also awful, blah, blah, blah. Talk to the neurodivergent person, and they're like, oh, they've never said that those things were a problem. Had I known, then we maybe could have done some of that discussion. So that's something I see a lot, unfortunately, is the student who wants to be supportive, the student staff member, I mean, is instantly going to go to the neurotypical person and be like, yeah, that's reasonable in my mind. Let's go into this situation, and then unfortunately have that bias going into it. So that's something I encourage y'all to think about. I know, at least for us, we're in roommate agreement season. We have our roommate agreements happen a little bit after opening, because we want to have folks figure out kind of how to live with each other first. So something to keep in mind, especially as we're having conversations with our community advisors, RAs, whatever you refer to them as things are getting elevated to hall director, complex director, whatever the titles are, that if there is a neurodivergent person involved in a roommate conflict, that there's that just a little bit of extra care to be added in there as well. The next one, my previous position I was just in prior to July was student leadership focused. So I actually transitioned positions over the summer. So when I did this presentation before, I was overseeing student leadership. But so things like RHA, NRHH, community councils, or whatever they are on your campuses and other student leadership positions are spaces that attract neurodivergent students, and neurodivergent students can flourish in those settings. So I'm talking about these types of things that we've created in our housing and residential life departments, where they're meeting with a staff member on a regular basis to get guidance and to affirm on how they're supposed to do things. They're learning how to do that connection-based stuff in these spaces, which can be really cool. With that, student leadership can be a lot of our time, right? Like it can be really time consuming, especially since a lot of the time they're volunteer. But this is something that if I had all of the time in the world and I had like a time turner from Harry Potter, for example, I would do a lot of research on this area, just because I think there's a lot of opportunity that we could have with neurodivergent students in the residence halls through student leadership. That's not me saying that all student leaders are neurodivergent. That is not the case. However, it does attract a lot of them, and I think that's a really cool opportunity that we could do something with if time was not something that we needed to, be cognizant of. So things to review for directness. So student staff on call responses, conduct meeting structures, and outcome letters. With that too, something we added since this one is when a student gets documented, we have something that we physically give them. It really helps neurodivergent students kind of understand what it is that's happening. I think that's something that we've seen benefit all students, not just the neurodivergent students, which has been really cool. Advertisements for events, being just really clear on what they are, can be really helpful. Same thing with, I always give this asterisk too of dietary things. So like say, for example, you have, I don't know, it's a peanut butter and jelly event, which I don't think are super common, but say that that's the case. A lot of neurodivergent people have a lot of allergies as well. That's something I can talk to y'all about at a different time. That's really fascinating to me. So naming some of those high allergen stuff for things like that can be really helpful. Rules, student guide information, and floor meeting information, just being as direct as possible. We give our students, I have it right here, I think I do. We give our students a copy of our student guide. There we go. Whenever they move in, we have it online. We literally ask them to open it up and utilize it for conduct meetings, for our resident hall association meetings. Like, we're using it all the time, and it's something we have eyes on quite a bit. So if it's something that you have, making them as direct as possible and repetitive as possible can be really, really helpful. I forget exactly where this fact/statistics comes from, but I know it's a real one, that we as humans don't remember things unless we hear it at least 7 times. And that's even more the case for our neurodivergent folks. And it's just helpful all around for folks. Next, websites, newsletters, really any sort of written communication. Clear, repetitive language is just really, really important for neurodivergent students and students in general. And with that, something that I've been able to do since starting here at Mankato is I've worked with our marketing person to help with that. She already does a phenomenal job. If you ever look at the Mankato Residential Life page, I think it's very easy to follow and it's really cool to see. But there's been things that her and I have worked on together to be more neurodivergent affirming. And at the end of the day, it ends up benefiting all students, which is really, really cool. So last, before we kind of have discussion, closing and ways to connect. So I'm going to have a QR code up on the screen if you are interested in getting a copy of this presentation, if you want to connect on any of these topics further, or something I also do outside. Oh, I'm sorry, I see a chat. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. I'm only seeing your X now. I'm going to pause my little rant before I go into this survey, but Elizabeth, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. My question, I typed it out so I wouldn't forget, because I would.
Thank you.
Are there specific behaviors or types of behaviors that you're seeing present in the roommate conflicts among neurodivergent students, or is it just kind of the general?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest trend is something that we see a lot is black and white thinking, right? And it's black and white thinking right away, which that's something in a neurodivergent brain, that initial reaction and initial thought, that's never going to go away. So something that I would encourage folks to do, just because that's usually a universal, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's just a natural reaction, I'm a big fan of systems theory, right? So if a student is documented for quiet hours, right? They didn't get documented because they're a bad person and the RA doesn't like them. They were documented because they violated a policy that was in the student guide that was something that they signed up for, right? So allowing for that right away is super duper helpful, and taking away the I'm going to say attack. It's not. We know it's not, but they don't always feel that way, the attack on themselves, because something that's really common for folks who are neurodivergent is something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. So they think right away that there's something wrong with them, and this is just a natural reaction they're going to have. There's a lot of really good tools for folks to navigate that. I think I've done a really good job of getting to a point where I'm good at it now too, but it takes time and it takes a lot of dedication and it takes a very affirming space to get to that point. So allowing for that system connection to happen right away is honestly the key. And it's super helpful right away because as long as your materials, as long as your communication is really direct, they're like, oh, there's the answer. And they're able to find that answer right away versus getting really stuck on, oh, I'm the problem. Because unfortunately, the students, for most students that I work with, they're told that they are. And that's not ideal and not supportive of them as human beings. So that's the big one that I'd share. So cool. Thanks. I'm sorry I did not see that sooner. Okay. So like I said, thank you to Every Time and Energy, neurodivergent students. And thank you for having this conversation. It's really super duper important to me. Like I said, everything benefits a lot of different folks. So I'm going to go to the next slide so that I can have the QR code up. Feel free to fill that out as we're kind of talking, asking questions, that type of thing. But for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd love to kind of work through and talk through stuff however you all would like. So, oh, sorry, hold on one second. My chat disappeared. Okay. I elaborate on what strategies have been found that can best support neurodivergent residents and the conduct process. Absolutely. So my new role, actually, that I started over the summer is overseeing conduct. So I've been doing a lot of conduct recently, and that's something that I really was excited about as I interviewed. I was an internal candidate, and now I'm here. I moved down the hall. But in the conduct process, some things that I really like that we already have, and then some things that I'm actually going to be changing within our stuff for conduct is really, again, focusing on that black and white thinking piece. And then it's something that we do, and I have it right here because I have a conduct meeting right after this, is we have a copy of our student guide that we can pull out, point to, use that as a physical cue. We also have our student rights and responsibilities laminated that we can just point to and walk through as we get them. On the same page, we also have our advisors and witnesses role. So we have everything right there that they can tangibly see, that they don't have to kind of fill in the gaps themselves for. Something that's really common as humans, it's not just neurodivergent folks, is we tend to fill in the gaps of things that we maybe don't understand fully. And unfortunately, I'd say this is 50-50. I've worked with neurodivergent students that are going to ask, every single question they think of, and then others have been told for so long in their lives that they ask too many questions, or they're not asking the right questions, that they're not going to. It's a really good opportunity for you to give prompts, really good opportunity for you to kind of name, hey, here's how things work here, here's how things work in res life, here's how things work in the campus as a whole, which can be really helpful because if a student doesn't fully understand something, they're not necessarily going to give you a nonverbal cue, or they're going to think that that's not a safe space for them to share. So you opening that up and giving some more of those opportunities for them to kind of show you where their head's at as far as what maybe they're not understanding, maybe what they are understanding, which can be cool too, is really, really helpful. So for example, if I'm meeting with a student about quiet hours or courtesy hours, I'm asking them what their understanding of the policy is first, and then I'm going from there, which sounds really basic, but that really allows for that student to be heard, and it allows for us to fill in maybe some of those, what we call operating assumptions. That's a phrase that I like to use a lot is, you assumed because that made sense based off of your operating knowledge, and that's okay. Like, you not understanding something as a student is normal. Like, that's why we have conduct meetings versus just sending out letters for things and stuff like that. So that's kind of what the big ones I would talk about for conduct, as well as the space, I think, is really important. So I have my background blurred because I have a big part of summer conferences stuff, but in my office, the lights are very affirming and non-threatening. I have stuff everywhere on my walls that allow for students to not feel like they're in a stuffy office, if that makes sense. And then I have a bunch of stims everywhere that I actively use in meetings, whether I need them or not. That way they know that they are able to utilize themselves too, which is pretty cool. I also start out all my conduct meetings with kind of giving a disclaimer of, hey, if you need to stand up, if you need to kind of move around, if you need to not make eye contact with me the whole time, that's okay. Like, I name that right away, so that way they feel empowered to do so. So that's a big one. So next one from Katie, we sent a copy of all of that with the conduct meeting notice as well. Yes, we also do that. We send a copy of it, and then we also have it in the meeting. So that way I like to start out with, after, you know, the hello, my disclaimer and all that stuff, being able to say, hey, you already got this. Most of the time they already read through it. And then if they didn't, that's an opportunity. And then I can reference it to say, hey, and if you don't have to remember all this, this is in a letter you've already got, which is really, really cool. Next one from Audrey. Can you share some examples or considerations of how to make fall training spaces for student staff more inclusive? Absolutely. So my office neighbor, Hannah Conrad, for those of you who maybe have been at K-State, NDSU, or here, has done some really cool things. Her and I have partnered on how to make our spaces more neurodivergent affirming. Something that we did right away is some of those examples of non-expensive fidgets is something that we have in every single session. We move the sessions around as much as we're able to different spaces. Something we pay attention to is lighting. We also pay attention to how our trainings are being given. So there's a facilitation book. I'm blanking on the name specifically, but if someone fills out a connection thing asking me the question, I'd be happy to follow up with Hannah and then send it your way. But something we really, really focused on with our hall directors and assistant directors is that our sessions and our trainings need to be engaging. We're not going to do much of the reading off of the PowerPoint and just having our CAs just sit there for 8 hours. That's not an option for us as we're doing our trainings. We're making it as interactive as we possibly can, and repetitive, emphasis on the repetitive piece. So if we're talking about conduct, we're talking about community development, we're talking about opening, we have a really big welcome week. We purposely collaborate with each other so that we're using really similar language. So that way we're getting that repetition piece, and we're getting to a spot where it's more neurodivergent affirming and just easier for our folks to understand, which can be a little bit of a challenge, since over the summer is usually when we create all of those trainings, and some people are out on vacations and some people doing camps and conferences. And so it can be a little bit tough to manage. It's something we're doing for this next year to kind of help out with that. And this is something we did at Kansas State back when I was a grad student there, is we're having basically, I think it's like 2 weeks before our student staff training starts, we're all getting together to go over all of the different trainings that everybody is facilitating throughout all of the student staff training. And so that's going to be an opportunity to get even more repetition, to get even more consistency across the board in trainings. And if we say, for example, see that there's an entire day where people aren't going to be doing a lot of movement, we change it. We change it up, we move it around, and things like that. And then we also do a lot of what I've been saying a couple times is really naming what are the guidelines for the space. Can you get up and move around? Do you need to ask to use the bathroom? No, like, you can just go. And things like that. And then we also have, and I think this isn't all that unique to us, but we also have a training binder that their training binder ends up being what they use for the entire year. So we want them to put everything there. They're expected to bring that to staff meetings. They're expected to bring that to one-on-ones most of the time too. So that's something that we're able to utilize as a tool versus something we're just giving them for training that they're only picking up when they have like maybe a weird conduct thing or weird incident thing that they're having to document or something like that. So repetition, really, really important. And mixing up who's doing the talking to. We try to give quite a bit of variety. So those are just a couple things. I'm sure there's others that my brain's not thinking of now, but those are the big ones. So with that, any other questions or thoughts?
I had a quick question, actually. Supervising a lot of student leadership, I do think it's very true that correlation between that correlation between a lot of neurodiverse student populations going into student leadership. And something I've noticed is that a lot of my student leaderships that I supervise are on very different points in the timeline of being self-aware, understanding and then kind of like potentially getting diagnosis for their neurodivergency, which I recognize is not a path everyone wants to take. But what are some good like resources or kind of frameworks that I can use to help my student leaders kind of move along that timeline? Because as I'm doing like professional development with them, as I'm trying to, you know, uphold standards of professionalism while also being equitable and understanding neurodiversity, I want to make sure that I'm still pushing them towards growing and developing as students and adults. But I'm finding I'm kind of coming up against the wall here where sometimes I don't have the resources or the support that I could provide them to kind of like help them. I don't know if that question is making sense, but I was wondering if you had any like resources or kind of ideas of how we can get students more engaged with their own neurodiversity.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a phenomenal question because I think that's what a lot of folks kind of work through. So if you fill out the form, I have a couple things that I actually have written up that I can provide to you. But I think the biggest nuggets from that I can just share right away is two things. One of it is you role modeling that behavior is huge. So whether you're neurodivergent or not, I think that's something that is really, really important because something I do more so in my coaching stuff, but it really helps with student leadership pieces is we live in a world that is designed for neurotypical people and neurodivergent people. It is just harder. That's true. But we as humans, we have the ability to kind of make the world and we have control over our actions, right? And so if we want to do something, we can still do it. We're just going to have to do it differently than neurotypical people would do. And so really having that framework has been really helpful. For example, if I'm working with somebody who really struggles with the eye contact piece, I'm not going to say, hey, you have to do the eye contact piece, but I'm going to say, hey, how are you going to connect with folks though? Because that's something that when you're meeting with folks and you're not looking at them, what are you going to do instead? Like, what is something that's in your comfort zone, that's within your ability? That's another big piece of it. It's in your ability to still get your job done. Because in that situation, for example, they need to connect, they need to recruit, they need to do the components that they signed up for. So like what works for them. And so sometimes I've seen students do some really creative things, but until I explained it from that perspective, they just thought, oh, I can't make eye contact, I can't talk to people, I can't, because unfortunately that's what they've been told. So that's one piece is that component. Another thing, and this one is it's going to be a little raggedy, so I give that as a warning, is everyone, because neurodiversity is so diverse even within it, for example, autism is right now considered like a linear spectrum is with how it's defined in the DSM-5. I have literally and figuratively bet money the DSM-6 is going to be more of like a pie chart that like has a whole bunch of different things that have different levels, and it's going to really show the complexities of autism specifically, for example, and ADHD too, and the others. But I think autism is a good example because we currently have that linear piece. Is that everyone's journey is going to be so different that it can be tough to break out of that linear thinking of, oh, I just need to learn more and therefore I'm going to be more developed, if that makes sense. And so that can be really tough, especially when we want to have that balance of that challenge and support, especially with our neurodivergent students. I think the big thing with student leaders to keep in mind is that one, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time they're volunteer. And second is their majority of the time they're coming from a space where they've been told they can't, they won't, they shouldn't, insert whatever here. And so what I found is with student leadership in general, and then with specifically neurodivergent folks who are at the different paths, is just affirming. Not every single little action, because that's not the case. I'm not going to affirm a behavior that I don't want. Like I want them to still follow expectations, still follow guidelines. But affirm in the sense of anything's possible, right? So there's something that maybe they think they have to do in order to achieve something. That might not be the case. And that's actually what I specialize in with my coaching is how can you maximize, your life, right? Like how can you still fulfill all of the bullet point list on your RHA president job expectations, for example, in your way? Like, how do you make it your version? Taylor Swift has been a huge thing to help connect students of like, how do you make it like blah, blah, blah's version, like helping folks kind of make that piece and have that understanding and that self-awareness. Because as soon as they kind of make that connection of, hey, if I just do this my way and in a way that's going to work for me, it's going to start working for everybody else. And then I acknowledge that that's really hard to do. And so I mean, I basically have a whole side job dedicated to it. So that's kind of a raggedy thought that is kind of encapsulating those pieces. So thank you. Neat. Awesome. Any other questions? I know Meredith has a couple little things to wrap up, but we maybe have time for another. What are ways to train your RAs to better prepare to support neurodivergent students? Great question. So I know what I was saying before, and I think this is really tough because I think we already asked, whether it's RAs, CAs, whatever you call them, I think we already asked them to do a lot. I think with this one, I think it's really breaking down what they're expected to do when interacting with students, right? So I think thinking of, I'm going to use the scenario of the first year RA who wants to save the world, right? That was me. That I name it. I was committed to the RA role. What are like understanding what the RA is expected to do, and then understanding what their hall director or complex director or whatever their title is can do in addition is really, really important, because they can only do up to so much. But something that's universal that can be just affirming to all students, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, is really encouraging the RAs to just slow down. A lot of the times they want to get to that resource, they want to get to that, hey, here's the solution of whatever it is you want to do. When in reality, neurodivergent people are verbal processors a lot of the time. And half the time they know the answer, they just have to have that validation, that affirmation to get that solution that they need to right away. And then really just having that clear definition of what your expectations are of them. I think that's a really big one, as well as, and this one again is a little bit more difficult, is in those one-on-one conversations where RAs, CAs naturally take sides of different residents whenever conflict inevitably comes up. Really, really, really supporting and encouraging those RAs to, one, try their best not to. I know it's really hard. But for a lot of folks, that can be really, really tough when it's a neurotypical person they're siding with, and it's the neurodivergent person who's really struggling and just needs that support. That can be really, really important. But I think the training component, I think that needs to be woven out through all of all of training. Like during our training, we have a neurodiversity 101 session where we talk about how we touched on neurodivergent affirming practices throughout our whole training, but that session is not the only time we're talking about it. That's just when we're connecting the dots. So having that direct expectations, that clear procedure, clear, this is what we expect of you, what are your operating assumptions, that's really, really important. As at the end of it, it's patience. It's patience, it's understanding that there are people that are different from you, different backgrounds, that sort of thing, to another degree, because once somebody has, whether it's a diagnosis or they self-identify or something like that, student staff, for example, can get a little bit more nervous, right? When in reality, it's, you need to be slow, you need to be patient, you need to be talking less and listening, which can be really hard to do when really all the student staff wants to do is give the resource, because that's what, in a sense, usually what they're trained to do is to report and refer. So, yeah. Cool.
I got a question for you. What would you recommend for law enforcement dealing with students on a daily basis? I work for the university, police department, and what would you recommend as far as training to deal with students to help understand them better and they can understand us better? What training would you provide for us or recommend for us to take?
Yeah, so so a clarifying question, is it campus like deputized police, or is it security, like security that doesn't have the extra training?
We are actual police officers. Yeah, we're actually police officers. Yep.
Okay, cool. And I ask because I've been at institutions now where it's both, and so there's differences there. So thank you for clarifying. I think with that, I think the big piece right off the bat is just this educational piece of some of these things that you see, more trends. I think a lot of police, especially when I'm working with folks, I actually did a training a couple months ago now with their students who were doing police academy stuff, which was really cool. It was really interesting to hear kind of what their thoughts were. But a trend that I saw in that space was a lot of stuff that they were trained to kind of see and say, hey, this is something that could indicate something like a negative thing that's happening, whether it's being drunk, high, whatever the case was. Sometimes weren't just neurodivergent behaviors. And so something we talked about is how do you, when the time allows, right? When the time allows, then when that's not harm to yourself or others, how can we slow down, ask questions that help us differentiate between if a student is under the influence versus just really nervous and really having a sensory overload experience, for example. And so that can be really, really nuanced, and it's not black and white. And I acknowledge that, but that's something that we did a lot about during that training. And I really didn't know what to expect going into that. But it ended up being really beneficial because we were able to kind of break down, say, for example, if a student is in the hallway and is having their hands up by their ears and they're just exhibiting some behaviors that are disrupting the community, what are some things that we can ask to help us figure out, are they under the influence, or are they having a meltdown? And then what do we do when those are the cases? So that would be a kind of a bigger conversation, but that's what I would recommend really starting with, because that's typically, at least in my experience, that's what people are trained. They're trained to kind of see, hey, what's the behavior, and then what do we do right away? But then the biggest thing is some of those neurodivergent things can just be really close to some things that do need that extra support, whether it's they're under the influence or something like that. So there's a couple, obviously everyone's different, but there are some trends of like the ears, and there's the trends of the rocking and things like that. So there are some things out there that would break down some of those things.
Thank you very much.
Cool. And I think with that, I took up all your time. I'm so sorry, but
You are just fine. That just brings us to the end of the hour. So I just want to thank folks for attending and engaging and asking great questions. And of course, to thank Beekah for sharing her expertise on this. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.